Welcome to Saving Lives in New Jersey, the COVID-19 Vaccine in You, a video podcast presented by the New Jersey Department of Health. I'm Dr. Meg Fisher. I'm a Pediatric Infectious Disease Specialist, and recently I've joined the New Jersey Department of Health as a special advisor to the Commissioner. Joining me today to explain the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines is Dr. Eddy Bresnitz. Eddy, can you tell us a little about yourself?
I'm a internist and preventive medicine physician and was at one point a chairman of the Department of Community and Preventive Medicine at what's now Drexel University School of Medicine. You and I actually worked there many, many years ago together. And then I went into Department of Health and Senior Services in New Jersey, where I was eventually the Deputy Commissioner of Health and the state epidemiologist. I then went to industry at Merck and was in adult vaccines. I was executive director there for over a decade, but was called back into government service in March by the Commissioner of Health in New Jersey to support her in the governor's office on the response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
So that makes it clear why you are exactly the person that we want to talk to about vaccine safety and efficacy. So why should the public be confident that these new messenger RNA vaccines are safe and effective?
Well, there's been a development of a lot of different vaccines, and several of which are coming online, but the first two that actually have been authorized by the Food and Drug Administration are produced by Pfizer and Moderna pharmaceutical companies. These are messenger RNA vaccines, and from the time that the virus was first identified, just about a year ago, to the time that these were authorized by the FDA, less than a year. And in the process of doing the clinical trials over the course of the year, the trials were overseen by not only the companies and the FDA, but also independent multidisciplinary advisory committees. There were three of them, actually. The first was what's called the Data Safety Monitoring Board, which was actually organized by the FDA, which basically looked at the data as it was collected, as the study was done, and then reviewed the data and was able to basically make a recommendation to the company to move forward to apply for an emergency use authorization, or EUA. Before the FDA issued that authorization, there was a second independent committee called the Vaccine-Related Biological Professional Advisory Committee, Product Advisory Committee rather, also looked at the data, reviewed the data very closely, and made a recommendation to the FDA that they should go forward with the emergency use authorization. They basically determined that the benefits of the vaccine outweighed the risks of the vaccine. And then finally, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, also an independent multidisciplinary committee. This committee advises the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the committee is called ACIP for short. It too reviewed the data, asked a lot of questions of the manufacturers, and also made a recommendation that this vaccine should be used by healthcare providers throughout the country.
Now, I know you've looked at that safety and efficacy data as well, and I think we were both pretty amazed to see that these vaccines were both 94 and 95% effective, and they seem to be very safe. So tell us a little bit about the steps that a vaccine has to go through in order for the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices and the Food and Drug Administration to say that it's okay for an emergency use authorization.
That's a good question. The development of any vaccine actually starts with what we call discovery phase. What is that discovery phase? That's the phase where the basic scientists look at the data, look at the science, look at whatever the technology is, and determine whether the candidate vaccine has a chance of actually being a good vaccine, having a chance of whether it produces a good immunologic protective response that will lead to prevention of disease ultimately when it gets into humans. Once it goes through the discovery phase, there's some animal studies involved as well, again, looking at the impact on immunology and potentially on safety. And then it goes through a series of phases of clinical trials. And they're numerical in order, 1, 2, 3, and there's a 4 as well. In the phase 1 and phase 2, what the manufacturer does in the clinical trial is to study the vaccine, looking for a dose response effect, basically looking to see how much vaccine is needed to get a good immunologic response, balanced against having too many side effects, such as injection site reactions. Maybe it's a couple of hundred people in a phase 1 trial, maybe less than that. In a phase 2 clinical trial, there's several hundred people, maybe up to 1,000. Again, testing the vaccine for the right level of what we call the antigen that would stimulate an immunologic response, balanced against not having too many adverse events. And then finally, when they settle on the right dose, and whether it needs to be a 1 dose or a 2 dose or a 3 dose series, they then conduct a phase 3 trial, which is usually a very large trial involving often thousands and thousands of patients. In the case of the 2 vaccines that are now available, they were tested in tens of thousands of people. In the Pfizer study, it was in almost 44,000 people. In the Moderna study, it was about 30,000, half of whom received a placebo, which was basically normal saline, and the other half received the vaccines.
So there's really very robust and extensive safety and efficacy things that all vaccines go through, and these vaccines went through exactly the same procedures. Now,
And not only that, what I talked to you is about the studies that are actually done either in animals or in humans. At the same time, the manufacturers are developing the commercial product, the volume of product, the number of doses they're going to need to use in order to vaccinate millions of people. And that's through the manufacturing process. And as you can imagine, these are biological products. And when we're injecting biological products into people to prevent disease, we don't want to cause serious adverse events. And so there are many, many quality control points that are basically invoked as these vaccines are developed. Hundreds and hundreds of quality control steps that are needed to ensure that, in fact, the vaccine doesn't cause a bad effect that you wouldn't want to happen. So that's a whole separate aspect. And when the FDA reviews the sort of the file in order to determine whether it wants to authorize or approve the vaccine, they also look at the manufacturing process and whether the right steps were taken. They even go and inspect the plants where the vaccines are produced.
and all that safety monitoring still continues as long as we're using the vaccine. So we're going to get even more information about these vaccines as we continue to give it to actually millions of people. I think that's a great basis for really being able to say that we're confident about the safety and the efficacy.
Yeah, there's a very robust, what we call post-authorization or post-licensure safety monitoring program. And with these 2 vaccines, which are using a very new technology, and considering that it was, vaccines were developed in less than a year, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration have developed very robust safety monitoring plans using previous surveillance systems, but also developing new surveillance systems to assess the vaccines for safety and effectiveness after when the vaccine is actually used in the real world outside of a clinical trial. So, for example, up to now, I think there's almost 30 million people in this country who've received at least 1 dose of either of those vaccines. And there's been a monitoring of the safety of the products in millions of people now, not just the 70-odd thousand that were in the clinical trials. And in this post-authorization monitoring of the safety, they haven't found any new safety signals to be concerned about. There's the expected local injection site reactions, such as pain and swelling and maybe some tenderness in the arm, and some systemic reactions such as headache or muscle aches or occasionally fever. In individuals, actually, a lot of people will have these sort of side effects, both with the first and the second doses. These are 2-dose vaccines, but they're generally mild to moderate in nature, and they basically resolve on their own within 1 to 3 days.
So lately, we've been hearing a lot about variants. How do we know how well these vaccines are going to perform against, how well are they going to protect us against these variant strains?
Yeah, so what is a variant? Let me just explain that for a second. Viruses are constantly replicating. As you can imagine, an individual who's infected has billions of virus particles in their body. and these virus particles replicate on a constant basis. And of course, with the many, many millions of people who are infected, not just in the US, around the world, there are trillions and trillions of viruses replicating. And as viruses replicate, they basically undergo mutations. Each of these viruses consist of sort of linked amino acids, which are the basic building blocks of proteins. And as they replicate on a frequent basis, some of the sort of these building blocks change in the reproduced viruses. Now, generally speaking, these mutations, they resolve on their own. They don't cause any changes at all to cause a new variant. But once in a while, these mutations, for whatever reason, lend an advantage to the virus particle itself, and that virus particle then begins to reproduce in an advantageous fashion, and then takes over, becomes the dominant strain that's circulating in the community. Now, a variant actually can be beneficial. It actually can cause less disease. And by causing less disease, it actually tends to propagate even more. But on the other side of the coin, it can cause it can be more easily transmissible to people, and can cause also more severe disease in individuals. And then the big concern becomes, the vaccines that you have, is it going to work against these new strains that are and new variants that are becoming dominant? And sometimes there's no change. They work just as well against these new dominant variants. And other times, these strains are a little bit more resistant to the antibodies that are produced by the vaccines themselves.
Well, I think that's pretty good news. And so far, we're hoping these vaccines are going to continue to work for a while. Now, let me ask you a question. If a person's already had COVID-19, do they really still need to get the vaccine?
The short answer is yes. And the question is, well, why? Wouldn't they be protected? You mentioned earlier that at least for these two vaccines, efficacy in preventing disease is about 95%, which is about as good as you can get. No vaccine is 100% efficacious or effective. But what we don't know about these vaccines is whether they prevent transmission of the virus. So an individual can get infected, not know that they're being infected, and if they've been vaccinated, the vaccine can prevent that infection from actually becoming symptomatic, making them sick. But we don't know whether the vaccine actually prevents transmission of the virus when it's in, for example, in their back of their throats or in their nose. And if they cough or sneeze or talk to people, it might be actually transmitted to people who haven't been infected and haven't been vaccinated. So one good reason for continuing to wear a mask, for example, after you've been vaccinated is, number one, it's not 100% efficacious or effective. And number two, you still might be transmitting virus to people who may be susceptible to getting infected as well. Two good reasons why. The third is the variants that you mentioned. I didn't say that there have been some studies that are suggesting that potentially a couple of the variants that are beginning to circulate in some countries may be a little bit resistant to the vaccines. And so we're also beginning to see some of those variants in this country. Not very much. They're still considered quite rare, but they may become more predominant. And it would be good, until we know more about those variants, for people to basically continue to wear masks after they've been vaccinated, to prevent potentially those variants from becoming more dominant.
So let's talk a minute about the timing of that vaccination. So if I had the disease last March, then certainly it makes sense for me to get another shot right now to kind of boost any antibody that I might have. But what if I just got sick last week?
Well, if you got sick last week and you're still ill from COVID-19, or for that matter, for any other illness that you might have had, you should get vaccinated. It makes no sense to do that. You're already feeling ill. The vaccine is going to have some, side effect, as I mentioned earlier. And so you don't want to add to whatever suffering you might have. Plus, if you're having natural infection from COVID-19, this vaccine is not going to help you fight the virus. It's a preventive approach. It's not a therapeutic approach. And so you're not going to benefit from it. The recommendation is to wait at least until you haven't been sick for, at least several weeks. And actually, with a natural infection, you're going to have some natural protection from further infection. We don't know how much, we don't know for how long, but when you basically get better after you've had COVID-19, it's because you're basically have had an immunologic response. And so, you don't need the vaccine right away. The recommendation from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is that you could wait up to 90 days before you get vaccinated. Now, we do know that, in fact, you can get reinfected. And actually, that would be another reason for wearing a mask, even after you've been vaccinated. You can get reinfected, and you could get reinfected with the variant. So it is important to get that vaccine, even if you've had COVID-19 infection. People might have had asymptomatic infection, not even know that they've been infected. And those individuals obviously will get vaccinated, even though they've had previous infection.
Good, thank you. So we know that as you've said, even after you get the vaccine, we still want you to do those kind of hygienic things. So wear the mask, keep your 6 feet distance from other people, stay home when you're sick. Those things protect you from other viruses as well, don't they?
Absolutely. In fact, what we're seeing this year, not just here in the US, but in other parts of the world, because people are doing all these things to prevent not just respiratory infections, but also gastrointestinal infections, we're seeing a decline, a tremendous decline in diseases such as the common cold, influenza, gastrointestinal infections, and so on. This time of year, we're typically experiencing, certainly in New Jersey, but all around the country, pretty high incidence of influenza and the common cold because people are indoors. They're not necessarily practicing the measures that we are now taking, seriously. And so that's a sort of a side benefit of having a COVID-19 outbreak. Now, I think people would agree that we'd rather not have the COVID-19 pandemic and put up with these other, common respiratory infections that we have during the season. But a beneficial outcome might be going forward once we get through this pandemic and people continue to actually practice these, hygienic measures such as masking and avoiding crowds, staying away from people, washing their hands, maybe not even shaking hands anymore, just elbow shaking. I think the handshaking has gone the way of, I don't know what. But we're not going to see it anymore. Maybe we need to be sort of bowing like they do in Japan and in other countries because they don't touch. And they wear masks in Japan and Asian countries as well. And so we're going to get the benefit of what they've had over the years.
Terrific. So one other thing we've heard a lot about is herd immunity. So we know that we want a certain percentage of people in New Jersey, maybe 70%, but maybe it needs to be more like 80%. What will happen if we don't get that percent of people immunized?
Well, let me just say that herd immunity, people use that term commonly, and I don't like that term. I like the term community protection. Herd immunity, that term actually was derived from studies in actually cattle, and basically, vaccinating some of the cattle for some cattle-related diseases. And then by maybe not having to vaccinate all the cattle, but there was a benefit to those that were unvaccinated. And that term was basically borrowed to apply to humans who were vaccinated, where not the whole population was vaccinated, but it could provide protection to the entire population, even those who weren't. The amount of vaccination that has to occur in a population before those who are unvaccinated, for whatever reason, they might have a medical contraindication, for example, or they refuse to get vaccinated, or they have some other reason why they don't want to get vaccinated or can't get vaccinated. There's a certain level that you have to achieve in order to protect the entire community. We don't know what that is for COVID-19. Generally speaking, we think it's about 80 to 90% for most viruses or bacteria, but we just don't know at this point. Now, part of the community protection will derive from natural infection, people who've already had COVID-19. But we also know that the level of immunity that you get from COVID-19 natural infection is not as good as what you would get with getting vaccinated, not just with one of the doses, but two for these particular vaccines. There are some new vaccines on the horizon that are single-dose vaccines, but the bottom line is better to get vaccinated, higher level of immunity, higher likelihood that you're going to have community protection, whatever the level of protection you need to prevent transmission of disease in the non-vaccinated populace.
Well, and we also like the idea of protecting the community by vaccination so less people have to get sick. So thank you
Correct.
very much, Eddy, for joining me today. We've really, I think, learned a lot about these vaccines and these diseases. And if you want to learn more about the COVID-19 vaccine in New Jersey, you can visit covid19.nj.gov/vaccine. Let me remind you, we like to end all of these pods with a caution and a plea for all of New Jersey to stay vigilant. Keep wearing the masks. Keep your physical distance of that 6 feet. Stay home when you're sick. Wash your hands. Make sure that you're cleaning surfaces that are widely used, doorknobs, things like that. And please get vaccinated as soon as you are able to get vaccinated. Thank you for watching, and stay safe, New Jersey.